Welcome to the sixth session of the 2020 FH Global Summit. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is our 8th annual summit. Our theme this year is Driving Solutions to Prevent Inherited Cardiovascular Disease, and we've been pleased to be joined by several hundred people from around the world each month, and over 1,000 people who have registered for this event. I'm Josh Knowles. I'm the Chief Research Advisor for the FH Foundation, and I'm Assistant Professor at Stanford University. I'm co-chairing this session alongside Dan Rader, the FH Foundation's Vice Chair and Chief Scientific Advisor. Dan is the Seymour Gray Professor of Molecular Medicine and Chair of the Department of Genetics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Please use the chat feature on the bottom of the screen to introduce yourselves and let everyone know where you're from. It's important to remember to change the setting to panelists and attendees if you want everyone to see your comment. We will take all questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. So please remember to use the Q&A function for any questions for the speakers and panelists. We will save some of these questions for the live question and answer session with the panelists, and we'll answer others in real time. Today's session is being recorded and will be available for replay following the event. We would like to thank our 2020 FH Global Summit sponsors for their generous support. And today I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge all of our partners for their support, including Amgen, Novartis, Regeneron, Emerald, Verve Therapeutics, Amarit, Arrowhead Pharmaceuticals, Canica Medical Products, Silence Therapeutics, and Bio. We'd also especially like to thank Esperion for being a foundation level partner. This series would certainly not be possible without their generous support. On average, it takes 17 years for research to make it to clinical practice, and one of the goals of the FH Foundation has been to connect the dots and shorten this gap. Guidelines for the identification and care of dyslipidemia, including FH, have been in place for decades, and while the science of lipoprotein A is growing and evolving, we know the same barriers in the healthcare system will limit the opportunity to address and support these high-risk individuals. The FH Foundation works to understand the needs of diverse stakeholders. Certainly one size does not fit all, and we aim to convene groups such as the Summit for our network of Cascade FH registry sites and the Find FH sites to share best practices and build on each other's success. This slide that you're seeing right now shows the learning that we've generated from our Cascade FH registry, which shows that though guidelines call for the testing for FH at an early age, and initiation of guideline-based therapeutic regimens, many people with FH are diagnosed in their mid to late 40s without statin initiation, leading to lots of increased morbidity and mortality amongst these patients, which is completely preventable. We also want to highlight that FH continues to be undertreated. These are data from our National Healthcare Encounters database that the FH Foundation has accumulated and acquired and been working on for the last several years. It's a remarkable data set, and it shows that while the use of the ICD-10 code for FH continues to increase, now there's about 292,000 individuals across the US who have been diagnosed with FH as defined by this use of this ICD-10 code. We still know that the use of other medications, life-saving medications, is lagging far behind. And these are some of the gaps and reasons why we're excited to hear from the speakers for today's session. Continue to learn from the best practices of implementation science from across different stakeholders and different areas of expertise for improving those at high risk for cardiovascular disease. In 2018, the FH Summit focused on implementation science, and we had the opportunity to hear from David Chambers, who is Director of Implementation Science at NHLBI, who highlighted the need to maximize the fit between interventions and practice settings in the broader healthcare system. Soon after that, the NHLBI held its first meeting on implementation science and FH, and now many of us have been using implementation science in our research and applying for federal funding, which is a very welcome development. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from experts in implementation science, not only at a theoretical level, but also real world and practical examples of the current state of implementation science in FH. And we're really happy to be led off today by Brian Mittman, Dr. Brian Mittman, a senior scientist at Kaiser Permanente, Southern California Department of Research and Evaluation, with additional affiliations at the University of Southern California and UCLA. He co-leads the UCLA Clinical and Translational Science Institute Implementation and Improvement Science Initiative. He previously served as a senior scientist at the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs Greater Los Angeles Healthcare System and a visiting professor at the UCLA School of Public Health and Anderson Graduate School of Management. His research interests include implementation and improvement science, health system science, embedded research, and innovative methods for the study of complex health interventions. Dr. Mittman, we've been really happy that he's been working with the FH Foundation over the last several years on implementation science research initiatives, and we're really happy to have him and welcome him today to our summit.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and the lead-in, as well as to the FH Foundation for the opportunity to speak. What I'd like to do is walk through at a relatively high level some of the key features and principles of implementation science to, in some ways, repeat and elaborate on some of the points that Dr. Knowles has just provided, and provide some background, set the stage for the subsequent presentations. So first issue, of course, is, first issue is disclosures. I have a variety of grant funding sources as well as affiliations, none of which represent conflicts of interest. The real first issue, though, is what is implementation science? But even before what it is, why do we need it? Again, Dr. Knowles provided some nice background, excuse me, getting over a cold, and I hope it won't affect my speaking. There are different bodies of policy and practice discussion that represent the key motivations for the field of implementation science. The translational roadblocks, I'll talk about in just a minute, the quality chasm, excuse me. And then we have the issue of the knowing-doing gap. Let me start with the latter, the knowing-doing gap. Many of you may have seen this article quite a number of years ago by Steve Wolf and Bob Johnson, where they basically did some back-of-the-envelope calculations to compare the net benefit to society between an investment in developing yet another drug, for example, another statin or another antidepressant, versus an investment in efforts to ensure that the drugs that we do have that are effective, other innovations that are effective, are actually used in a more reliable and more appropriate manner to reduce the 17-year gap that Dr. Knowles talked about. And the result was, as you can imagine, that we would do much better in terms of societal benefit by ensuring that the existing effective known interventions and innovations are used to the greatest potential. So that is one of the motivations for the field of implementation science. The translational roadblocks, again, that I know many of you are familiar with, are illustrated by this sort of diagram, where we basically envision what a highly efficient, effective societal research program would include, and that is a robust body of basic science to develop new insights into the causes and etiology of disease. We would then conduct type 1 translational research to convert those basic science findings into effective clinical treatments. The implementation science field, or sometimes called type 2 translation, enters the picture at on the right-hand side. And that is efforts to ensure that when clinical research does produce highly effective, beneficial interventions, drugs, devices, other innovations, that they reach the patient, that they reach the bedside. And that's, again, the focus of our field and the focus of a great deal of investment over the last a couple of decades by NIH, as well as other funding agencies around the world, in efforts to accelerate translational research, to reduce these roadblocks, and to ensure that the results of science do lead to patient outcomes. Another set of ideas that, again, I know many of you are familiar with, and that is the IOM's work on the quality chasm, the fact that we continue to see significant gaps between the quality that we know we can provide through known effective interventions and the quality that we see in the healthcare that's provided to consumers, to patients. So again, another motivation for the field of implementation science to reduce the roadblocks and accelerate the flow of effective interventions into routine practice. Let me provide just one other brief diagram and an illustration of implementation science in its role. And this is what is essentially a causal model or a flow diagram that shows how different kinds of ideas and advances and developments ultimately lead to reductions in mortality. And the example illustrated here, of course, is the effects of smoking on lung cancer incidence and mortality. And you can see in the center of the diagram different bodies of research that have helped us to understand these causal connections. So the effects of smoking on lung cancer, of course, were studied by basic science and research in physiology and epidemiology. We now have drugs that help us to reduce the effects of smoking, or to reduce smoking rather, to reduce the effects on lung cancer. The implementation science field or implementation research enters this picture early on in this causal diagram. The implementation science field is focused on ensuring that the effective smoking cessation interventions are delivered, which in turn will reduce smoking behaviors, which in turn, of course, reduce lung cancer and mortality. So again, each of these bodies of research activity contributes to different parts of this causal diagram or the causal relationships that we see. And the implementation science, as I said, gets involved in the very beginning of the process to ensure that when we do have effective interventions, that they are delivered. So if we were to step back and look at the last 10, 20, even 30 years of implementation science, my practice and policy colleagues always ask, what have you done for us lately? What are some of the key insights or principles or findings from implementation science? And there are a couple of them I've highlighted on this slide that you will hear more about during the subsequent presentations. But we know from a great deal of research that implementation barriers tend to be numerous, multifactorial. They also tend to occur at multiple levels, and perhaps more challenging still, the fact that they vary across time and place. So some of the multifactorial, multi-level barriers include the fact that oftentimes clinicians lack knowledge or lack the skill, or they simply don't have time or need reminders to provide evidence-based care at a certain point in the patient's course of disease. Looking at a different level, we know that patients are often resistant to certain innovations, or they too lack the knowledge or lack the motivation or lack the ability to seek out and obtain and adhere to the care that they know is effective. There are often reimbursement or health coverage barriers, other fiscal barriers, there are barriers of time. And this is just a subset of the many barriers that stand between the knowledge that we have and its reliable delivery and routine care. As a consequence of these multifactorial, multi-level barriers, we know that the implementation strategies that we deploy need to be multi-component. A physician educational program is unlikely to be effective in improving implementation if we know that we're dealing with patient resistance and problems in reimbursement and time. We know that those multi-component interventions, again, need to be deployed at multiple levels. But going back to the issue of varying across time and place, every health system is different, every community is different. The specific barriers that stand between known care and its delivery tend to vary over time, but they tend to vary across health system and across region as well. So we need to be sure to conduct site-specific diagnoses to identify those barriers, and the strategies that we deploy need to be highly tailored to local circumstances. The principles of precision medicine can be applied here, and in some ways we like to talk about implementation science as requiring precision medicine on steroids. We need a very high level of customization of local tailoring in order to see implementation success. So I'll often think of the challenge of moving clinical practices as that of trying to roll a heavy boulder up a hill. And not only is that boulder very heavy, but in fact, it is often held in place by a series of ropes and chains and bars. And oftentimes our implementation efforts are essentially equivalent to eliminating one of those ropes or chains, but leaving the others in place. So if we provide physician education, we've eliminated that particular barrier, but if we haven't dealt with the reimbursement barriers or the time barriers or the patient resistance or lack of motivation or patient support, that barrier, that boulder rather, is not likely to move. So one of the key principles, again, of implementation science is the need for us to recognize and take seriously the challenge of multiple barriers and to not stop at interventions or implementation strategies that address one or two barriers. There are likely to be many others that we need to identify. So in thinking about the multi-level nature of implementation barriers and implementation strategies, we have the benefit of a great deal of work on the so-called social ecological model that allows us to identify the different levels at which care is delivered and the different levels at which influences on clinical practices and health-related behaviors are likely to occur. I won't go into the details here, but basically in the modern era, healthcare is a complex endeavor that is influenced by a number of different sources and barriers and factors. We often like to contrast this with 1950s medicine, where we essentially had one or two physicians working in their own offices. They would make decisions, they would receive insurance reimbursement, and that was basically the end of it. No evidence-based medicine, no guidelines, no pre-authorization, no quality measurement and monitoring and feedback. Consumers, of course, were much less actively involved. But again, healthcare delivery is very different now than it was back then. So it's often useful to think about checklists in healthcare, and the implementation science field is no exception. We know that in order to see implementation success, we need to see each of these conditions in place. We have to have a good, solid foundation of evidence. We know that clinicians and staff need to have the knowledge and skill to act on that evidence. We also know that the professional norms need to endorse those evidence-based practices. I've talked a bit about the regulatory and fiscal factors. There are a number of other external expectations and incentives. We, of course, do need consumer acceptance and knowledge and adherence. Oftentimes, we have all of the first set of factors, 1 through 6, and we still don't see change in practice. And oftentimes, the reason is that the health system and practicing clinicians assume that they're delivering high-quality care. So we need to add to this list of necessary but not sufficient conditions good evidence of quality gaps and an understanding of the root causes of those quality gaps, and feasible logistical arrangements that allow care to be delivered that's consistent with evidence. Again, sufficient time, sufficient space, sufficient equipment. So this sort of checklist, again, is another way of reminding us that we need to deal with the multiple barriers at multiple levels and need a long list of conducive conditions for change to be likely. So going back to the multi-level model, on the left-hand side of this slide, I've listed some of the key groups that need to be involved in implementation. Again, this is not a challenge that can be addressed by a health system alone, or by a specialty society alone, or by a patient advocacy group. We need each of these groups working in concert, in collaboration and coordination, in order to achieve the conditions that I indicated and to achieve the change that we want. Let me spend just a few minutes talking about patient advocacy groups and illustrating some of the appropriate roles and necessary roles for these groups by talking about some of the activities the FH Foundation has conducted and engaged in recent years, partly motivated by David Chambers and the other talks at the summit that Dr. Knowles mentioned, but based on some broader thinking about how the FH Foundation can facilitate and support higher quality, better care. So we know that we need the external regulatory and fiscal factors. We need payers as well as purchasers to be supportive of care. We need medical specialty societies. Patient advocacy groups, and the FH Foundation has done this quite effectively, have a role to play in reaching out to and influencing each of those external groups to ensure that they are aware of the quality gaps that exist and that they are supportive of efforts to address those gaps. Patient advocacy groups, of course, also have an important role to play in influencing and supporting patients and consumers in ensuring that they have access to the best available evidence and can contribute and participate in their care. The FH Foundation is also embarking on efforts and has been engaged in efforts to actually participate in the care delivery process. Health systems have the ability to deliver care, but don't always have the ability to influence patients outside of the brief encounters they have with the healthcare system. Patient advocacy groups like the FH Foundation have an important role to play in ensuring that patients have support and that they do receive some of the services that are needed in order to assure high quality care. Just another example of what are many others of the appropriate roles for a patient advocacy group and roles that the FH Foundation has played in a quite effective manner, and that is research. To ensure that the research funding agencies are aware of these issues, aware of the need for new knowledge, aware of the quality and implementation gaps, and are supportive of and provide funding to support the work that's needed to identify those implementation gaps and to overcome them. So I'd like to conclude with just two final thoughts and two final comments or themes that I hope you will take away. One of them is the issue of the learning health system and the idea that health systems should not simply deliver care based on the way that they've always delivered care, but instead actively seek to learn from what they're doing and to continuously improve. One of the key features is the idea that healthcare systems use the data that they develop by and for care delivery for research purposes and continuously learn using those data. Closely related to the learning health system is the concept of an embedded research program. That is the type of program that I'm involved in at Kaiser Permanente, where we conduct research that attempts to simultaneously produce scientific knowledge, the traditional focus of research, but also endeavors to produce near-term improvements. So unlike quality improvement activity, which is focused solely on improving quality, and unlike pure scientific research, focused on generalizable scientific knowledge, we attempt to do both. And this is the kind of research that we need in the implementation field, where the researchers are working actively with health system leaders, with frontline clinicians, with consumers, and with others in order to simultaneously improve and study and learn. And then one final comment and idea, and that is the concept of multi-level interventions, multi-component interventions that the research community increasingly labels complex health interventions. And we need to understand some very key and significant differences between simple interventions such as drugs and devices versus complex health interventions such as implementation strategies. And it's useful to think about it in terms of what we as a research community are attempting to support in terms of decision makers' questions. When we study a drug, we're ultimately trying to determine whether that drug is effective or not. It's oftentimes a yes/no question. The FDA would like to know whether to approve it. Health systems need to know whether to add it to the formulary. And frontline clinicians need to know whether to prescribe that drug or not. When we conduct research to answer this yes/no question, we oftentimes randomize our patients or other subjects. Half of them receive the intervention or the innovative treatment and others don't. We focus on the impact and we have the ability oftentimes to produce a strong yes/no answer. Yes, the intervention is effective. No, it's not effective. When we deal with complex health interventions and we ask the question, is this implementation strategy effective? Is this innovative healthcare delivery program effective? Is this health promotion program effective? The answer is almost always, it depends, or sometimes. These are not highly robust interventions that tend to be highly effective across settings. As I said earlier, their effects vary across time and across place. So we need to not attempt to answer the yes/no question, but instead to understand how they work, why they work, and where they work. And I'll leave you with this final slide and set of thoughts, and that is that implementation strategies, other complex health interventions, unlike drugs, can be tailored and adapted in a significant manner. They often will be adapted, and they should be. And as researchers and care delivery professionals, we need to understand not just whether to deliver a certain intervention, but to understand how it needs to be adapted, how it needs to be tailored, how it needs to be customized. And by doing so, we can enhance its fit with the local patient or the local setting, as David Chambers had indicated, and ensure that we maximize effectiveness by ensuring a high degree of fit. So let me stop at that point, and I look forward to the next presentations and time for some discussion of these issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mittman. That was tremendous, and I can really appreciate what you've done in outlining the potential and the challenges for implementation science. And I can tell that the international audience is really rapt and is going to be addressing multiple questions to the panel when you come back. So thank you so much. I'd next like to introduce Dr. Meghan Lane-Fall. She's the David E. Longnecker Associate Professor of Anesthesiology and Critical Care at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the co-founding director of the Penn Center for Perioperative Outcomes Research and Transformation. She's also the vice chair of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity and associate professor of anesthesiology and critical care with a secondary appointment in epidemiology at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a board certified anesthesiologist and surgical intensivist, and whose main research interest is improving healthcare provider communication and transition at handoff of sites of care. And this is really important for all of us that are having surgical procedures. She employs qualitative and mixed methods to develop effective communication strategies to incorporate human factors while complementing clinical workflow. Her work is best characterized as a healthcare delivery science, falling at the intersection of implementation and improvement science. She's also interested in building research capacity in health services research, and it's been wonderful to work with her in getting this talk together and also helping her learn about FH, and we really look forward to her talk. So thank you.
Dr. Knowles, thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to be with you all this morning, or whatever time of day it is in whichever part of the world you are. It's also my pleasure to follow Dr. Mittman, who is one of the giants in implementation science. And I have the dubious distinction of bursting the bubble of implementation science. So I am a firm believer in IMPSI and what it can do, but there's some really important limitations that we should consider as we do this work. And so I'm going to talk with you about some of the things that keep me up at night as an implementation scientist. And I hope that when we have our roundtable discussion, we can talk more about that. So by way of disclosure, I'm funded by the NIH and AHRQ and some internal funding from Penn Medicine, but I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. So I know that your group, the FH Foundation, you've been thinking about implementation science for a long time. And I was so excited to find not just the 2018 Global Summit, but evidence of the conversations that have been happening between the FH community and federal funders in the United States and global funders, really trying to understand how to bridge the evidence to practice gap and how to promote the uptake of evidence-based practice in FH. And as I'm sure you all know better than I do, there are a number of evidence-based practices in FH where there is an apparent evidence to practice gap. And Dr. Knowles did a great job of highlighting some of those in his opening remarks. Specifically, there are opportunities to improve the timeliness of diagnosis of FH, the timeliness of treatment, cascade screening for family members of folks who've had diagnoses of FH, and then also advanced treatments for those with homozygous FH. There are a number of developments in implementation science that I'm very excited about that are relevant to FH. So I want to highlight those before I talk about some of the difficulties in the field. Specifically, I love the idea that we can do research that centers both effectiveness of interventions and implementation at the same time. And this is an innovation that was described by Jeff Curran, who's based at the University of Arkansas. And he talked about 3 different types of hybrid effectiveness implementation trials. And as we build evidence about how to improve care globally and specifically in FH, this particular trial design or approach is really, really important in centering or elevating the attention to both of these at the same time. We've also seen some developments in terms of quasi-experimental trial designs. So we tend to privilege the patient-level randomized controlled trial in biomedical research for very important reasons, specifically because it helps us deal with confounding and threats to inference. But for many reasons in implementation work, it's hard to randomize at the patient level. We end up using a quasi-experimental approach. So we've seen some innovations in this space, specifically with the use of stepped wedge trials, where we have multiple sites that roll out an intervention over time. Usually, ideally, you would randomize the timing of that rollout to deal with some threats to inference. But we're also seeing some adaptive trial designs, specifically looking at different implementation strategies. And so, as Dr. Mittman mentioned, we want to make sure that our implementation strategies account for context. Sometimes you have a very good idea about which implementation strategies you want to use, but those ideas are sort of an educated guess. And so in these adaptive trial designs, you can start off with one implementation approach, see how it works, and then for sites or places or people that don't respond, you may a priori decide to change to a different strategy. And you can do that successively over the course of a study, trying to get some efficiency from having it all built into one study, but allowing you to study more than one implementation strategy or set of implementation strategies. There are also behavioral economics informed strategies that are being increasingly brought into implementation science. And I'm so proud to be at the University of Pennsylvania, where we see a lot of work in this space using nudges, defaults, and other strategies that are employed in behavioral economics to catalyze behavior change with respect to healthcare. We have more measures now. So when I started in implementation science about 8 years ago, we were leaning really heavily on qualitative measures, in part because of the richness that qualitative inquiry brings, but also because we didn't have a lot of validated measures. And so we're seeing a lot more movement in the measure development space in implementation science, which helps us be more precise about the concepts that we're measuring. And it allows us to talk sort of across fields and across institutions about implementation progress. So the stages of implementation completion is a concept that was pioneered by Lisa Saldana. And then the acceptability, feasibility, and intervention appropriateness measures were developed by Brian Weiner and colleagues. And so that helps us have a common language about the implementation outcomes that describe studies to improve the uptake of evidence-based practice. There are now more journals dedicated to implementation science, and Brian Mittman was part of the very first one, the flagship Implementation Science Journal, but we now have Implementation Science Communications. We have implementation science journals that are focused on mental health, and there's a new one that I'm part of, Global Implementation Research and Applications. So we're seeing more venues to describe implementation efforts, which I think helps generate excitement about the space. And there's more funding. So the NHLBI has been an amazing partner, especially in FH research, and the NIH in general has been a great partner, but we're seeing more NIH institutes come on board. And most recently, NIDDK has come on board and joined the investigator-initiated implementation science RFA. So I'm excited about all of these developments. At the same time, there are some potential pitfalls to implementation science. And I had the privilege to be part of a small group that convened at Penn a few months ago to talk about we did a pre-mortem of implementation science. So basically a conversation about what will have gone wrong. So in 10 years, if we look at ourselves and we say, well, that didn't pan out, what will have led to the downfall of implementation science? And so we came up with a number of different ideas. One of them is that implementation research takes a while to do. So when you're starting off with contextual inquiry and you're trying to understand your context, you're then trying to map context to strategies, and you're trying to test strategies and then test sustainment, which can take months to years. That time course is challenging in a typical paradigm where you have grant funding from external groups, where the length of a grant could be 1 year, 2 years. You're lucky if you get 5 years. That's still sort of short when you think about implementation from start to finish. And so the time course of the research is challenging in terms of generating evidence that is readily shareable. Implementation research is also quite expensive because you're paying for people's time. And so figuring out how to manage the expense of implementation research is a challenge. And I think we'll need to see increasingly partnerships with external funders and with learning health systems to make this viable. There's also a difficulty in determining the costs of implementation, and this is an active area of research with people trying to characterize what implementation cost really is so that we can, as we try to scale up our implementation efforts, actually help learning health systems and other groups to figure out how and when to implement. And then we have to develop a workforce, to further develop a workforce with skills in implementation science. And we're also seeing some movement in this space. So there are training institutes that are hosted by the NIH. There are other groups that have come on board with implementation science certificates, master's degrees, PhDs, and a la carte courses. So we are seeing a lot of energy in this space as well. But this is still a relatively new field with a relatively small number of people who know it well and are able to do this work, who have the requisite knowledge base. And so that's a challenge to getting this work done. But I want to focus on three particular problems that I see as very relevant to FH. So the first is looking at the difference between implementation practice versus research. The second is looking at emerging gaps in implementation evidence. And then the third is equity and implementation. And I don't think I'm going to present them in that order. We'll see. We'll see how I set up the slide deck. All right, so the first tension that I want to bring up is the tension between implementation practice and research. And I can tell you when I go to the NIH Academy Health Conference on the Science of Dissemination and Implementation in Health, which is a mouthful, there are a bunch of us who are scientists, and we're talking about rigor and reproducibility, and we want to make sure that we measure exactly this thing in this way. We go all out on our qual and how exactly we're doing qual, and is rapid ethnographic inquiry even a thing? And then there's a group of folks who say, that's nice, but I'm actually trying to do work right now. We already know a lot. So how do I deploy what's already known to affect implementation right now? And I think that as a community, we're ready to have that discussion, but there is a tension between the folks that want to go out and do right now, because there are patients and groups that need help, that need that evidence to practice gap bridged. And then there are folks that understandably want to focus on advancing the science. And so sometimes it's difficult to balance those tensions. The second concern that I wanted to bring up is equity. And as Dr. Knowles mentioned, I have a leadership role in inclusion, diversity, and equity. And so I do think a lot about equity in clinical care. I want to highlight here a paper that came out of the Cascade FH project, which I know is one of the major initiatives for the FH Foundation. And I was delighted to find this paper because it just sort of put it right out there that there are not just differences in uptake of evidence-based practice, but we see disparities in how those evidence-based practices are actually deployed. And so in the upper panel there, you see when you look at statin use and high intensity statin use, that women are less likely than men to have this evidence-based practice to receive statin use and high intensity statin use. And then when you look at race and ethnicity, you see that Asian patients are less likely to have high intensity statin use. Black patients are actually more likely. So as we think about implementation efforts, as we think about bridging the evidence to practice gap, if we don't actually pay attention to equity, there is a risk that we will perpetuate the inequities that are already in place. There's also a risk that we could worsen those inequities. And as I think about implementation strategies that deploy technology, for instance, we know that technology is not equally distributed across populations. We know that folks that are socioeconomically at risk are less likely to have access to technology. We know that people that live in rural areas or in LMICs, for instance, are not as likely to have high access to broadband, high-speed broadband internet. So if we deploy an implementation strategy that requires access to high-speed internet, we're going to potentially perpetuate an inequity. So it's really important that equity is at front of mind as we develop implementation strategies to improve the quality of care for the whole FH population. The third problem I want to bring up is that implementation research by itself can create gaps. And this is something that we as a community have been talking about more and more as we think about where it's easy or easier to do implementation research versus where we actually need the implementation research. So I, as an investigator, am going to look for those places that are well-resourced, that are ready for me to do my work, right? They're the ones that I come calling and they go, that's great. We have this problem. We want you to come in. We have a research nurse. We have all of these other things in place. And I go, great, that's a great place to do research. But where is the knowledge actually needed? A lot of times that knowledge is needed in community settings, in under-resourced settings, where the buy-in may or may not be established, right? You may have to convince the health system that FH is really important. Um, the implementation challenge is going to be much different in those settings than it is in the well-resourced settings that are ready to take up the evidence-based practice. And so if we only focus our implementation research on those well-resourced settings, we're going to be leaving behind a really important group and not building knowledge about how to improve the uptake of evidence-based practices. So how might we prevent implementation science from actually creating more problems? The first approach I would advocate for is that we need stakeholder engagement from the earliest project stages. And as Dr. Mittman mentioned, there's an important role for patient advocates here. We want involvement of everyone who touches a particular process or a particular disease entity, for instance, to be a part of implementation research from the very beginning. Oftentimes, when we talk about community-based participatory research in biomedicine, what it means is a researcher comes up with the question, designs the study, and then at some point looks at a patient and goes, this is okay, right? And that's not what we need. What we need is really genuine, deep engagement from the very beginning to define project goals and research questions. And we may need to compromise. Sometimes we have to make compromises that favor practice. And so, from the QI world, we have to think about what's good enough in terms of measurement. And then sometimes we need to make compromises that favor rigor and reproducibility. But we have to have those conversations together to move forward together. Second, I would say consider equity in all of the projects that we do. So who exactly is in our stakeholder groups? And how might the strategies that we're thinking about include or exclude certain groups? And then along with that, think about which groups or settings are actually most in need, and think about pivoting our project goals or our strategies to center those groups that actually are more in need. And then third, I would say we need to conduct implementation research in varied settings. So as Dr. Mittman mentioned, context is so critically important here. And if we don't conduct implementation research in settings at various levels of readiness, then we won't have a full understanding of the barriers that are in our way in terms of getting evidence into practice. So we want to think about how to set up research projects so that it's easier to participate. We want to build community ties so that all of our research projects are easier. So instead of building a project team just as you're thinking about a project, we should be thinking about developing infrastructure so that community groups are engaged consistently. And then when you need a community partner, it's much easier to find one. And the conversation is a much easier one. The infrastructure is all there. It's harder when you're sort of starting from the beginning for every project. And then finally, I would say we need to measure what matters to stakeholders. Researchers have one thing in mind in terms of what we're looking for measures, but sometimes our stakeholders, and here I think of patients as the most important stakeholder, have very different priorities and very different outcomes that they privilege. And so we want to make sure that the projects that we do are of value to all the people that are engaged in them. So I want to thank you for your time and attention. I will turn the floor back to the FH Foundation team, and I'm looking forward to the roundtable.
Dr. Lane-Fall, thank you for that tremendous talk. And there's a lot to unpack there. I think it's clear we need to go from a house made of straw to a house made of bricks. And how are we going to do that? I think is going to be a ripe source of questions for the Q&A session. So thank you so much. The last speaker of the day I want to introduce is Laney Jones, PharmD, MPH, who's an assistant professor in the Genomic Medicine Institute at Geisinger. She got her Doctor of Pharmacy degree from the University of Sciences in Philadelphia and her Master of Public Health from the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia. She's an alumna of the Mentored Training in Implementation Science, a K-12 sponsored by the NHLBI at the Washington University in St. Louis. Her research interests include implementation science, FH, and pharmacy services. Her current research projects focus on closing the no-do gap for the identification and treatment of individuals with FH, by facilitating the implementation and sustainability of evidence-based programs. We had the pleasure, the FH Foundation had the pleasure to partner closely with her and the Geisinger team, and we welcome her to share some of her research today. So thank you so much for joining us, Laney.
Thanks, Dr. Knowles, and the FH Foundation team for the opportunity to present, and excited to have the privilege to follow Dr. Mittman and Dr. Lane-Fall, who kind of set up implementation science within FH and some of the pitfalls, and now I'll bring it to an application of using implementation science in the field of FH. So my talk today is titled Highlights on Implementation Science from this Impact FH study that spells out identification methods, patient activation, and cascade testing for FH. So I first just want to take 1 minute to say that I don't have any disclosures, but this work that I'm going to present today is funded by NHLBI. And this study is really a partnership between Geisinger and the FH Foundation, led by Professor Amy Sturm and Dr. Mary McGowan at the FH Foundation. And it really exemplifies what Dr. Lane-Fall was just talking about, but community-based participatory research where we've really come together with the FH Foundation even prior to submitting this grant and helping us co-develop the research questions that were both important from our side and their side in the identification of FH, and then also partnering throughout the whole research process. So as I go through the aims, it'll become very apparent about which members of the FH Foundation team have been present, but just to highlight a few that our first aim talks about different automated screening approaches, and we're using the Find FH algorithm, of which Kelly Myers, who has presented at the FH Global Summit in previous years, has talked about. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then Amanda Sheldon and Kat Ahmed Davis, along with Mary McGowan, have really been helping us do some of the focus groups that we've conducted as part of this aim that I'll talk about today, and really helping us to develop those questions, attending those focus groups, asking questions, and then also on the back end, doing all this intensive qualitative work and research coding that we're doing now. And I would also just like to thank on this slide all the colleagues that really make up this FH Impact FH team, and thank them for their dedication to the work. So the protocol paper for the Impact FH study is now available at Circulation Genomic and Precision Medicine. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the team about that. And just to put what I'm going to talk about in context, I'm going to briefly talk about the entirety of the Impact FH study, which is really methods to improve identification of FH. And aim 1 is really focused on those automated screening approaches to flag potential FH probands. So we're looking at developing a comprehensive approach to that. So we're looking at using Find FH as a machine learning algorithm developed by the FH Foundation. We're looking at genomic screening approaches, so using the MyCode Community Health Initiative at Geisinger. And then also looking at different phenotype-based electronic health record approaches, such as those developed by the Mayo Clinic. In aim 2 of the grant, we're really focused on improving communication methods to improve cascade uptake. So we've created a family and healthcare provider packet, family sharing and cascade chatbots, and then also established a direct contact program to reach out to relatives at Geisinger. And these methods were all optimized in the first part of this study, and then will be tested in a prospective pragmatic trial that should be starting relatively soon. And this is where the implementation science kind of portion comes in, and where most of my work is done is in creating this comprehensive FH program model. And how we're doing that is we're taking implementation outcomes associated with those automated screening approaches and family communication methods to improve FH identification. with the ultimate goal of creating a comprehensive program that includes implementation strategies that are generalizable to other healthcare systems to improve FH identification. So this study and this aim have multiple components, but today I'll just focus on the focus groups that we conducted with individuals with FH and clinicians. So for all implementation science work, we've heard Dr. Mittman talk about different kind of frameworks and models, and the one that we selected for this study was the conceptual model of implementation research, which was developed by Enola Proctor to really guide this work. So when we conducted these focus groups, we developed a guide of questions that really addressed these implementation outcomes. Specifically, we were interested in the acceptability and appropriateness and feasibility of these different kind of innovations that we wanted to study. And then what we did is that we coded these focus groups with the clinicians and individuals with FH and tailored the definitions from Enola's paper to focus on acceptability, appropriateness, and feasibility for what made sense within the context of our problem and what we were trying to solve. A lot of the conceptual model and the definitions were developed more for mental health and public health. So just these definitions are essentially the same, but have minor like tweaking and wordsmithing, and then also to fit the innovations that we were planning to study. And then here's really what we found. So for our acceptability, we found that what's been highlighted before by the FH Foundation and in the talks today is that there's really this lack of FH education and awareness, and really the need for proactive FH care. And we found that our stakeholders, individuals with FH, found these automated screening approaches were acceptable, but they wanted to learn this information at the same time as their clinicians. And that clinicians wanted help in reaching out to their patients to let them know that they had been flagged and that they needed to come in to be further screened for FH. The family communication methods could be useful, and most individuals with FH wanted to reach out to their relatives first before the healthcare system or clinician did that. And clinicians really highlighted that time and resources were potential obstacles that they would need to figure out in order to be best able to serve their patients in this capacity and reach out to their family members. They did find that both of these initiatives were appropriate. So the automated screening approaches, individuals felt that they could, that these would help make earlier diagnosis of FH, allowing them earlier access to treatment, and then hopefully reducing cardiovascular disease burden in the future. And clinicians felt it would be appropriate for those automated screening approaches to flag those individuals that needed to be screened, because this would allow them to make that diagnosis and wasn't diagnosing their patients, but then it would also help to prompt these conversations about family screening. The family communication methods also had a role in communicating with family members, and individuals felt it was appropriate to have multiple options, as some might work better in communicating with certain relatives than others. And clinicians felt that direct contact could prompt some family members to actually come in, but again, noted that they would need some help in doing that. And the last implementation outcome that we looked at was feasibility. And this is a big one because this can either have your innovation either sink or swim. And we've found very positive kind of outcomes that these two initiatives were feasible because similar programs to these have already been successfully implemented. So individuals with FH especially talked about receiving genomic results in one of the focus groups, and that this process that we were talking about for automated approaches was very similar to that. And then they also talked about other apps that they use to communicate with relatives that might have been similar to the chatbot technology. Clinicians also talked about different improvements and initiatives at their own organizations that sounded very similar to these. So they were also very interested in seeing them succeed. For the automated screening approaches, we know that we have the capability to mine the EHR and find these, or the electronic health record, and identify these individuals. But clinicians really felt that there needed to be some education and training on how this tool actually worked and what the outputs actually meant. And that an overall feeling was that for these to be feasible, that there needed to be some technology support and personnel in order to ensure success. So the next steps of where we're going is we finished the work on the focus groups that were in preparation to submit a manuscript with the FH Foundation on. And the next step is really conducting interviews with proband's relatives and clinicians that participate in that prospective pragmatic trial of those enhanced family communication methods to see what we learned in the focus groups was really saying, you know, these are our pre-implementation outcomes. So what do people think about them that haven't received them? And, you know, how can we best improve them? And now that we have all that data and have made all those adjustments, how do people feel actually receiving these different methods? And what might still need to change in order to make it useful for them? And then the final part of the study is to really look at using intervention mapping, so a technique in implementation science, to develop and tailor implementation strategies for the context of FH identification, cascade testing, and treatment.
Thank you so much, Laney. That was fantastic. And now we're going to welcome all of our speakers back onto the panel. So thank you. And we have some questions in the Q&A. There's a specific one for Dr. Mittman. So we'll start off with that. And then we have several others that have been posted and sent to me directly. So Dr. Mittman, Eric Seabrands from the Netherlands asks, in translation 2 setting, do you assign specific methodologies for the various dimensions or levels? Smarter approaches and PDSA cycles, etc. It's difficult to choose between them when designing an implementation study. I don't actually know what all that means. So maybe you, if you do, you can tell us what that means.
So actually what I may do is provide a brief comment and then ask Dr. Lane-Fall to address it, because she actually talked on this point specifically. There are a number of tools that are available to us from the improvement science field. And as Dr. Lane-Fall said, one of the cutting edge areas of activity in implementation science is the desire to synthesize and draw from the best of implementation science and improvement science. Each of those approaches takes a slightly different tack to address the same underlying problems. The improvement scientists are much more pragmatic, much more willing to acknowledge the heterogeneity and the need for iterative approaches and rapid cycle adaptive approaches. Implementation scientists too often like to behave as if we're clinical trialists studying drugs that don't change at all in a set of patients that tend to be much more homogeneous than they actually are, but certainly more homogeneous than different healthcare settings. So I don't know that there's any existing guidance for how to choose from among them, but I think the search for alternative designs and methods from the broader set of fields is the right way to go about it. Megan, do you have thoughts from your experience in, I think, synthesizing and drawing from both of these fields?
Brian, I think you hit the nail on the head. So we do in implementation science, I think, need to move a little bit faster and learn something from the improvement science world. I can tell you that the smarter approaches and the smart approach to specifying your project goals very much parallels the way that you would specify a research question. So I think those approaches are totally aligned. With respect to PDSA cycles or PDCA cycles, so plan, do, study, act, or plan, do, check, act, as you mentioned, Brian, it's sort of an iterative approach to problem solving that I think works in improvement science. In implementation science, sometimes those cycles are too fast to be able to derive generalizable or transferable knowledge. So that's a potential area of tension. I do think you could, in theory, deploy a PDSA cycle as part of facilitation, which is an implementation strategy that's not well specified. But those, I agree with you. I don't think there's a right way to do it. Always use this approach when you have this problem.
So
I could just add one other quick comment, and that is the step wedge design that you mentioned is a version of this sort of adaptive approach. So that's another one to consider.
So Dr. Lane-Fall, we have a specific question for you. I mean, you're an anesthesiologist. We're in a COVID crisis. You've been dealing with something that's fast moving. Our patients are affected by COVID. They're high risk. You can't wait for always all the science to implement things. I mean, in that setting, you have to try to save lives. And, our FH Foundation likes to be nimble. We want to move fast. So what can we learn from the work that you've done saving lives in the time of COVID and translate that to FH to move quickly?
So it's been so instructive to be a care provider in this period of time. And I've been a part not just of the care, but also of the conversations amongst implementation scientists going, well, what do we have to offer when the evidence is uncertain and it's moving so quickly? The big lessons that I've learned are two. One is that leadership engagement is vitally important. And I think we already knew that. But what amazed me was just how quickly things can move when you do have the leaders engaged. And so when the CEO of your health system or the CQO or the CNO says, do this, it happens, right? So as we're thinking about implementing evidence-based practice in FH, if you have the ear of the leaders at the very, very top, it's going to be much easier to get things moving, and barriers sometimes just fall away. So I think that's one huge learning point I took away. The second one is that even when the evidence is uncertain, we know a lot from implementation science about how to change behavior and how to effectively message to people. And so I think about the social marketing approaches that we use in implementation science with respect to how we package information, how we present it, how we deliver it, how we determine that people understand it, how we hold people accountable. And so even though the evidence is evolving, we can still use some of those implementation strategies to change behavior.
That's great. Now, maybe for all the panelists, a few months ago, we had another session on disparities in FH, and we highlighted again that issue. It makes all of us feel guilty. We published the paper, we know that they exist. And Dr. Lane-Fall, you highlighted that we need to be addressing this, in the community level instead of Catherine likes to call it the academic white tower, the whatever the term is. So, but that's not easy. If it was easy, it would have been done. So how can we actually practically, get into the communities where implementation science is needed? Is it just a funding issue? What are the things barriers that need to be overcome? So maybe I'll pose that to all three people.
So I have thoughts, but I'm actually curious about Dr. Jones's experience. Laney, how you have a giant team, and I know you've engaged community members. So how has that come through?
Yeah, I would say it's not an easy answer, Dr. Knowles, and I agree. If it was, we would have all done it by now. But even looking at the identification and the kind of treatment perspective, I think there's this overarching barrier is that, a lot of people that are currently practicing just haven't had education about FH. And I think that's starting to change, as we heard from you earlier, Dr. Knowles, that the number of people with FH identified is decreasing, maybe not at a rate that, we all think is acceptable, but we're getting smaller. We're closing that gap on only 10% of people knowing now. I think we're at a higher number, and it might be 20% I heard earlier. But I think we need to also solve the part, not only from our clinicians' perspective, but when I've done my research through my K, which was really focused on treatment of individuals with FH, I heard a lot of patients say, my management is no different today than it was yesterday. And I think we really need to also convince our patients that this disease, affects them differently, and that we need to more aggressively treat them in order to see those effects. Because no matter what we build, unless we get people to come and buy into it, not only our healthcare systems and our providers, but also our patients. So I'll let Dr. Mittman and Dr. Lane-Fall comment.
So I have a couple of thoughts that I think are complementary to those that have just been offered. This in my mind gets back to the importance of fully engaged, partnership-oriented research. We like to say that the research community and research experts, in quotes, bring to the table perhaps 1/3 of the knowledge needed to do this work effectively. The health system leaders, clinicians, and others who are delivering care represent the next third. And of course, the consumers, patients, family caregivers represent the other third. And I think when we embrace the concept of fully engaged partnership-based research, where the research questions are identified by those three groups working together, where the study designs, the kinds of outcomes that are measured and reported, where the implementation activities are the responsibility of all three groups, that increases the likelihood that issues of disparities and the insights that are needed to fully understand and address them are part of the thought process rather than the ivory tower academic researchers determining for themselves what is important and how to go about studying it. And as we all know, the US, the world is doing much better now than 5, 10, 20 years ago in understanding the importance of these engaged partnership-based approaches, but I think we have still a ways to go to fully realize that vision and the benefits.
So I agree with what's been shared so far. I have two additional thoughts. One is, as we think about building our groups of stakeholders, it's important that we ask ourselves, who isn't here? So do we have a full representation of a spectrum of patients, a spectrum of caregivers, of health systems and healthcare providers and payers for that matter? And then the second is that, as a qualitative person, I tend to think about why questions. So why is it that we're seeing the patterns we're seeing? And when I looked at the Cascade FH data, just that little snippet, what I saw was that Black patients were more likely to have high intensity statin use. Why is that? Because usually they're less likely to get things. And is there something interesting that we can learn about how people think and how they make decisions that will give us some insights that will help all patients? When I think about pediatric emergency care, for instance, we also see that Black patients are much more likely to get evidence-based care after head injury, where the evidence is that they don't get a CAT scan. So when you see these patterns that sort of turn on their head what you're used to seeing, I think it gives you some interesting insights that are worth digging into.
That's fantastic. We have a question from the chat, and I have one that says, across all specialties, what recent practice changes or guideline updates stand out as the shining lights, for what we should be hitting? I mean, I know about hepatitis treatments, which came on like gangbusters, and I think the new stroke imaging guidelines have also been implemented pretty quickly. But what other examples do we have that we can say, oh, we got to follow their lead? And I'll pose that to everybody. And Dan, you probably have some examples too. So why don't we start with anybody who wants to jump in? Go ahead.
So let me make a quick comment on hepatitis C. Gilead has actually done a nice job of supporting research in this area, but the research teams that are working on it, as is too often the case, have recognized some significant disparities in the fact that
Oh no. Well, we did have trouble with his audio earlier. He'll come back on, but in the meantime, Laney or Megan.
So one of the things that occurs to me is that those interventions that require just one touch are a little bit easier to implement in some ways, and where I've seen particular synergy between behavioral economics and implementation science is in those interventions where you need, just to nudge behavior in a certain way. So one of the projects I'm thinking about at Penn was trying to improve the prescribing of generic drugs as compared to brand name drugs. And so what a team did was they made it just a little harder to order the brand name. So the thing that would pop up when you ordered in the ordering screen was the generic, and you could still order the brand name, but it was just a little bit harder. And there was this massive shift in prescribing in every drug except one, which was Synthroid, which is actually what you would expect to see because the bioavailability is actually slightly different of the brand name versus the generic. And so what it showed them was that people were still thinking and still choosing the appropriate drug, but it was a little easier to do the right thing. So across areas of medicine where you see those sort of single touch interventions, I think we're seeing improved uptake.
Yeah.
And we're still trying to figure out for complex interventions, which I would include FH care in, because there's so many different steps. It takes a little bit more.
Yeah. Laney or Dan, if you have ideas, or we have another question, either or. Okay, great. We have another question in the chat from Marina Kukul at UPenn. We've been talking mostly about heterozygous FH, which is a common condition, affecting about 1 in 200 individuals, but there's also a more severe form of FH, homozygous FH, which is much more deadly, much more rare, but we also know there's gaps in homozygous FH care, and there'll be a paper about that coming out from a registry relatively soon too. What can we do or learn about implementation for rare conditions where there won't be as many stakeholders involved, but the condition is more deadly?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll take that one, but I'll preface my comments by saying that this is largely speculative.
Problem. We're okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that rare diseases have something in common in that it's a small but usually intensely engaged group of stakeholders. And so I suspect that those approaches that are needed for homozygous FH are going to be the same ones that are useful for any rare disease. So engaging the stakeholders is part of it, but you already have a deeply engaged group of stakeholders. I think figuring out how to tell a compelling narrative is important here. And so there are going to be issues with dissemination of information and also engagement of stakeholders that sort of control the levers of power, control funding, and making a compelling argument to them. So I think about policymakers and legislators and funders and the use of narrative and engaging them and getting them excited about a particular initiative or a particular disease. Another thing that occurs to me is that there's a lot that we can learn about care overall from folks that have rare diseases. And so to the extent that you can highlight the parallels, what can we learn about care of FH overall when we think about folks with homozygous FH? I think it's going to be easier to sell it. And as someone who has a handoff study funded by the NIH, which is like usually not a thing the NIH funds, the reason I got it funded was I was able to say, we're going to learn from handoffs about implementation science in acute care. So if you can say, we're going to learn about all of the care of people who have maybe any kind of hypercholesterolemia from the care of patients with homozygous FH, that could be a hook to bring folks along.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Dan, any questions or others on the panel? Any questions?
So this is Brian. I hope you can hear me now. My apologies for the technical glitch. So just a couple more thoughts on the most recent question. In the healthcare delivery field and implementation science, we often like to talk about the trade-off between large sample quantitative work and in-depth qualitative work. And if you think back to the causal diagram that I showed in my smoking cessation example, oftentimes we will deploy medication and we sort of run to the end of the causal chain and determine whether lung cancer incidence or mortality changes. If we were to devote our data collection analysis resources to looking inside that black box and to tracking the causal mechanisms and the intermediate outcomes, oftentimes we can learn valid, reliable data, evidence, and insights from a smaller sample if we do take the time to track the process more closely. The other point I'll make is that in the US, of course, we're moving increasingly toward large integrated delivery systems with good electronic medical record systems, with a lot of data harmonization and virtual data warehouse type arrangements that allows us to pull data across multiple sites. So some studies that may not have been possible in the past in rare diseases are more feasible now because of these connections.
Thank you so much. And I think, Dan, we'll end on a question from Dan. So go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. This has been super discussion. Really appreciate everybody's participation. I think many of you, if not most of you, know that the FH Foundation has also embraced Lp(a) as another inherited familial-based risk factor for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And I think many of us feel that Lp(a) is not very well known, is not measured nearly as much as it should be based on evidence. And so my question for our panelists is, here's a diagnostic test, or at least a predictive test that has to do with the prediction of cardiovascular risk that guidelines support doing, that is very much underutilized. How can we think about applying implementation science related approaches to the encouragement or the appropriate use of a diagnostic laboratory-based test such as Lp(a)?
So I can offer some generic thoughts, again, going back to some of the comments in my presentation, that we need to diagnose first and treat next, that the first step is to understand existing and likely barriers to adoption of that technology, with the full expectation that those barriers are likely to differ across different types of health settings. And if we can conduct the root cause analyses and identify the barriers, focusing on barriers at multiple levels, then we can develop and deploy the multi-level interventions. As we've learned from the FH Foundation work, having the involvement of the patient advocacy group, having the involvement of the medical specialty societies and other stakeholders is critical. In that particular area, the Society to Improve Diagnosis in Medicine is actively involved in and interested in these kinds of issues. But I think we should not be beginning any work like this without first identifying the stakeholders, bringing them together, and ensuring that we are taking a multi-stakeholder partnership approach.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Other thoughts?
Oh, Dan, I just wanted to add too, I think the struggles of the diagnostic testing for Lp(a) aren't just solely for that. I mean, I think we also have that issue in FH and just ordering a typical lipid panel, as well as in hypercholesterolemia in general. So I feel the strategies that we develop for these kind of larger, affected populations of individuals can also be translated to Lp(a) and others, where it is really a simple diagnostic test and blood that might already be available that can be run. And it might just be getting out that education that now there is medication to treat people with Lp(a), which there hadn't been in the past. So I think just changing that story and that narrative, which we've heard throughout this, and getting those stakeholders involved, like Brian had just said, to really kind of toot the horn and get people excited and motivated to do those things.
So I also wonder, and you all are going to think I'm a behavioral economist, and I swear I'm not, if there are behavioral economic approaches that you could employ here. And, you could even think about an opt-out approach, where the question becomes, would you have a problem with us testing your patient for this, as opposed to, can you order this test? I see Dan nodding. As the amount of blood required for each test goes down, as our ability to perform screens of tests improve, can we think about, a point of entry where if you get blood drawn in the appropriate type of tube, they just run it, right? And then you find out that your patient has an abnormal level. But we have to get creative in how we think about these things.
Great suggestion, Megan. We've been thinking along those lines, so good to hear you say that.
So there's a last question in the chat about, COVID's deadly, but FH is also deadly and LPA is deadly. How come we can't speed up drug discovery? And I would end on a note of hope. I think this is a time, for 20 years we had statins and now in cholestyramine. And, just in the last few years, we've had PCSK9 inhibitors, inclisiran coming down the pipe. We've got evinacumab that was just approved. We have bempedoic acid. We have ezetimibe. We have SGLT2 inhibitors. So I think for those with diabetes, I think this is, and we have LPA antisense therapies and other therapies for LPA coming soon. So I do think we've been waiting. The FH community and the LPA community has been waiting a long time, but the genetic revolution is happening, and we're starting to see the fruits of that. And I would ask that you check out the webinar we did last month with Kiran Musunuru, who was really great about that. Also gene therapy and CRISPR technologies. So I wanted to say I wanted to thank our speakers. What a fantastic summit, adding to the tremendous summit that we've had so far. I wanted to say our next summit will be April 21st, and we'll highlight FH treatment. So it kind of gets to this next, that last question. Dr. John Castelline and Dr. Derek Rawl and Ann Goldberg, some of the giants in the field of therapies for FH and LPA, will be joining us, and we hope to see you then. We have an Advocates for Awareness program. If you know somebody who is interested please refer them to the FH Foundation advocating for FH and lipoprotein A. We've asked you to nominate them through our website. Advocates regularly speak at events, including grand rounds, corporate and scientific events. They build awareness online and in their local communities, schools, churches, and workplaces. Advocates are critical to our advocacy efforts to reach out to Congress in addition to their state representatives. And please check out our website. The URL is located there. And finally, I would say we have an LPA 101 webinar coming up on March 24th, intended to give individuals and their family members an educational overview of LPA as an important genetic risk factor for heart attacks and strokes. Registration is free and is now open. It's a great resource for patients and clinicians and other healthcare providers. So thank you all to the individuals around the world who joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you so much.